So, quick agenda. I don't actually even know why I have the slide. Thinking about it now, it's really pointless. I'm going to be talking about three things. We're first going to introduce UI composition and what it is, and the concepts behind it. Then we're going to look at front-end composition and server-side composition. Now, it might sound a bit strange that we have server-side composition if we're talking about UI, but hopefully it'll make a bit of sense when we get towards the end there. The demos today are going to be web applications. So I'm going to be demoing using React, and the web server is going to be an ASP.NET Core MVC web server. But the concepts translate across to almost any front-end technology, including WPF or Silverlight, if you're unfortunate enough to do that. The same also works with JSF, if you're also unfortunate enough to still have to work in that space. The server-side stuff, a little bit trickier because it depends on the stack that you're actually using, but hopefully the ideas should translate depending on where you are. So let's get right to it. This is going to be our application. It is a website where you can order DVDs. And when I was coming up with the slides, I thought, hey, it'd be a great idea if we did Blockbusters because they shut down, didn't they? Turns out, no. So in South Africa, we literally have Blockbusters that you can walk install and rent a DVD and bring it back the next day, like a library for movies. But I don't know who I'm kidding, because when last has anyone been in a library in either? So we've got that going for us in South Africa. Let's assume that we were contracted by Blockbusters to develop the system. So they want a system where they can rent DVDs out to people, the DVD will get shipped to the person, and then the next day a courier guy will come and pick the DVD up and take it back to Blockbusters. Sounds like a pretty good business model, and if it works well, maybe they'll even expand to streaming media online. And if that goes well, they might even start creating their own content. But baby steps. So we have to develop the system. And depending on kind of your school of training and your experience, you might start one of a few different ways. If you're kind of database focused, maybe you'll start doing some ERDs. That's a pretty good way. Maybe if you're a UML kind of person, you'll start looking at doing some class diagrams. Or if from this morning's session, if you guys have been through Eric Evans' DDD book, maybe you'll start working with aggregate roots. So there's a lot of different ways you can start designing your system. And the important thing is you're going to start thinking about the concepts of what my core enterprise is made up of, what my core system is. And in this case, it's a movie or a series or a product, something like that. So we might start with a product that then has these attributes on it. It's got a title, it's got a description, it's got a URL that shows a poster. So you highlight that. It's maybe got another URL for the trailer. We've got some rating information that we can show. Maybe we've got a price or an attribute that's related to a price. How many items of this we've got in stock, so whether someone can rent this DVD or not. And then something that represents the ordering process. But if we take a step back and think about it, we've gone and modeled a movie now, and we've given it these attributes. But a movie isn't a collection of attributes on an object. We can get into quite a philosophical debate about what a movie is and from whose perspective, and you could argue that potentially a movie is the experience of ingesting and it doesn't actually matter. What is important, though, is what a movie is not, or what the different elements are not, and how they do not relate to each other. So for instance, the price of a movie is completely unrelated to the title and the description of the movie. Unless, of course, there's some crazy business model where you want to charge more per character of the description of the movie. That's where compression makes a lot of sense. But the price generally is unrelated to what happens with the rest of the product. And in fact, if we were to isolate the price component from the rest of our system, the price itself has a different meaning when we talk about a movie to the product catalog system, which thinks about titles and descriptions. So from the keynote this morning, if you guys remembered talking about bounded context, we've got two different bounded contexts here. We've got a pricing context, not necessarily, it's actually a pretty poor example of that, but we've got a product catalog bounded context as well. And one technique you can use to find these different bounded contexts is anti-requirements. So an example is where I said, if the description changes, should the price change to match that description? And if there's no relationship between them, that's a good indication that you've got a separate bounded context. And I'm going around this bounded context stuff for a reason. We'll get there just now, trust me. So if we want to build a system that's got these isolated components or these different bounded contexts, we start looking at the teams. So we take a step back and we look at the teams that we would use to build this. So maybe we would start with the back-end team. And it's back-end because they've got beards, of course. Except for the guy at the bottom right who doesn't have a beard. But that's because he's Brendan Eich, the guy who invented JavaScript. And JavaScript is clearly front-end, unless you're unfortunate enough to have to work with Node. Kidding, I love it. But that's front-end. And maybe we've also got Tim Berners-Lee, who's a web developer, self-titled. Also no beard. But we know that modern front-end developers have cool headgear and cool hairstyles. So if you've got a back-end team and a front-end team, and who's got a DevOps team here? Good. Oh, there's a few of you. Sorry, guys. You're probably doing something wrong. If you've got a dedicated DevOps team, there's something in your development and your delivery pipeline that's not quite matching up with your business context. And if you've got back-end teams and front-end teams that work on portions of these systems at a time, you've also got a mismatch. Remember Conway's law? The structure of the organization represents the architecture we get at the end. So what we actually need is full-stack teams. Guys that don't have beards and don't have hair, but they can acquire them. But I don't mean we need a team full of full-stack developers. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we need a full-stack team. So that means you've got back-end people in the team, you've got front-end people in the team, you've got database people in the team, you've got a full stack of skills within the team. So if we go to our example that we had, we've taken our movie system and we split it up into a product catalog, a marketing service that shows the trailer. We've got a pricing engine, we've got a review service that shows IMDb ratings for our movie, etc., etc. Each of those different bounded contexts have their own back-end. They've each got their own database. There could be completely different databases. So the warehouse and the review system has got a Redis cache. The marketing system has just got a cloud query that it does. It doesn't actually have a persistent store anywhere. It doesn't matter what the backend is because it's contained within that bounded context. If we want to present this to the user, though, so how do we get that information on the screen? It means we also need a front-end component within that team. So the team needs to be able to do the back end, the database, as well as some HTML markup. We need the team to be able to produce some kind of widget that's going to end up on the front end that's going to display the YouTube trailer for the movie or the Vimeo, whatever, trailer for the movie. If we had an iPhone app, we would also need within the same teams some iOS skills. And the same goes for an Android team. We would need the equivalent skills within each team to build the widget depending on where that application is being deployed and run. Now in the demo today, it's going to be, we're going to be talking about React, so it's web, and on the back end is going to be server-side, is going to be ASP.NET Core. But whatever the vertical slice is for that bounded context, the team needs to have the full set of skills required to develop that. And the important part, so I don't actually mean to go forward there, the important part is that you don't have to have one team per, well, I'm going to phrase this very poorly now. You don't need to have one team for every bounded context that you have. But it's important that each bounded context has a dedicated team. The reason for this is context. So if you've got a team that's working on the marketing bounded context or the marketing system, and suddenly Treasury comes along and says, hey, everyone, VAT's changing to 15% from 14% in a couple of weeks. You need, if you've only got 3 or 4 people that do your entire development for the entire system, that team needs to be able to shift contexts to work on the pricing system without worrying about breaking functionality with what they're doing in the rest of the system. And you need that independent versioning ability between the teams as well. So when I'm talking about teams, I'm not saying you have to have 60 teams within a company, but there has to be that isolation so you maintain the team autonomy when you're doing development. So we've got these teams structured, and we've got front end, because we're talking micro front ends, we've got teams that can deliver front end. So how do we get this? Well, if we want to deliver something, for instance, about the product catalog, so we just want to say the title, the description, and maybe the poster for the URL, or for the movie. That's markup. That is only HTML. So all we need is a way to take the HTML from the product catalog service and bundle it into this kind of shell. So the shell is kind of everything that sits around that brings in the different components from the different bounded contexts. And what it brings in could just be HTML. It could be HTML plus JSON plus JavaScript plus CSS plus whatever it needs to. But it's just bringing in simple markup and stuff that's been around when we're doing web development for years. Where can we do this composition? So there's 3 places that I've seen this done. You can do composition on the front end, which is what we're going to address in a couple slides. You can do server-side composition, which we're also going to discuss, and you can do database composition, which I'm not touching at all because it's horrible in my opinion. So let's talk about front ends. If you guys are developing front ends on the web, you are typically using some kind of modern front end framework, whether it's Angular, React, Vue, Ember, Aurelia. Are people still using Aurelia? Whatever it is, duck.js, wat.js, whatever you want to call the next framework. All of these frameworks have ways of componentizing or modularizing code and exporting bits of functionality. Even if you didn't have this, we've got web components, which is a standard. So web components is a standard for taking embedded and encapsulated bits of functionality and being able to include it as HTML. It's obviously not adopted in many browsers yet, so we've got Polymer, which allows us to then sort of fake it until it gets there. So web components is a standard. All of these frameworks are working towards, well, not that, I don't know if they're intentionally doing it, but they seem to be working towards enabling web components as well. Angular has Angular elements. AngularJS would have directives. React has components. Ember has components. Vue has components. Almost everything has components except Angular. Who knows why? But we've got these ways of taking encapsulated functionality as a module, as a piece of code that we can embed. But how do we do this? So the demo today is going to be using React. So we've got a React component that we want to export. This React component also includes some markup that must go along with it, some CSS that needs to go along with it as well, and some JavaScript that needs to go along with it. What we can do is we can take these bits of code that are related to ourselves, and we can use another tool called Webpack and combine those bits of code into one package. And that package we can then export. So what that means is we might have a pricing component that is an encapsulated bit of code that includes a React component, it includes some CSS, some JavaScript, and some HTML. And that is everything it needs to be able to render on the front end. So we include that component in our web page. The web page then renders that. And then as it renders it, it sees, okay, well, I'm the pricing component, so I need to talk to my pricing backend so that I can display the price. But the good news is, because we've got a full stack team that worked with that bounded context, we've got coupling between the pricing front end and the pricing back end. So the pricing front end component knows how to talk to the back end. And coupling within a bounded context is great. Coupling outside of a bounded context is where you run into problems, as long as you've got proper versioning. So we can do the same with the marketing component. We can have another bundled component and deploy that. The same with the search component. And each of these knows how to talk to their own backend. The search component might be talking to an Elasticsearch database, for instance. Whatever, it actually doesn't matter. Because we bring this all together in the shell in the front end, and it just knows how to talk to its own backend. I say it just knows. We'll get into it. So once we've got these components and we've bundled them up using Webpack, how do we distribute them? The easiest way is just to distribute them over NPM. NPM is great because you can just ship the stuff to the NPM public repository if you really want, or you can host a private NPM repository, or like I've done in the demo today, you can use GitHub repositories as your NPM sources, except for one of mine, which I've done a local file system because I don't trust the conference internet. So we take these modules, we package them up, we deploy them via NPM, which means that we can then include them in our application. And let's have a look at what this actually would end up looking like. So here is our demo application again. And I've got a bunch of movies here. So we've got Black Panther, Star Wars, Nuns on the Run, whatever. And we can search for stuff. If I search, it does some filtering. I don't know if that's actually big enough. I can probably zoom in a bit here. So it does some filtering. Get rid of that. I can go to the details page. And it kind of loads up and shows me the details for that particular movie. Each of these components, so this comes from the product catalog service, which has got its own dedicated back end. It's also got its own dedicated front end component. I've lost my mouse. Hello, mouse. There it is. This comes from my marketing component. I've got a pricing component, over there, which, again, all of these have their own separate backend, and there's a hidden over here, because obviously it threw an exception in the background, there's a reviews component or a ratings component. So these have all got their own separate backends and their own separate front-end pieces that are brought together in the front end. Now, it's nice to see it kind of in the front-end thing, because it just looks great. But if I was working with a search component, which is this almost entire screen, everything from the search bar down is its own dedicated component with its own dedicated backend, I might have a different screen. So the search team, when they're working on their application, this is what it looks like for them. It doesn't show the poster because that's irrelevant for them. They care more about the data. More importantly, though, than the way it looks, if they go into the details, they've got different behavior. So the detail screen, when you're working within the search service bounded context, has got different behavior. It might be useful for that team to, when they go into the details, navigate to the Elasticsearch page that shows that particular search record. Whatever, that team decides what's important to them, and when it's hosted in the shell, or when it's brought together in the main application, they can change the behavior that instead of going to that, it takes you to the details page of that particular movie or product or whatever it is. So let's look at the code that we did to achieve this. So this is my front-end application. It's just a stock standard template file application, and all I've done is on my home page, I'm displaying a search input component, which is a React component that comes from a module that I've imported called microfrontends.search. This module, if I show you over here, comes from, it's probably really small to see this, I'll zoom in now, is an NPM package that I've imported from a GitHub repository. And there's my 5 different micro front ends that I'm importing into my application. So we've got a details, a pricing, a ratings, a search, and a trailers thing. So I've exported that functionality, and all I do, like I showed you earlier, is I import it from that particular module, and then I can use it as a component. So how do we bundle this functionality? Well, let's look at the search services application. So here's my search module that I'm exporting. It's a TSX file. And all I've done is I've got a, zoom out a little bit there. I've got a search input component, React component that I want to export as a main class. And I've got a thumbnail component which shows the little summary of the movie details. How do I bundle this? I mean, I can obviously see how I would include this in my own applications. If I go to my home page here, it looks pretty similar, except I've got slightly different shell information around and whatever. But I'm still just displaying my search input component. The way that you bundle this is using Webpack. So I've got a Webpack module called search, which starts from the search module and takes everything that the search module requires. So my search module needs React as a dependency, it needs a React route as a dependency, and I've put these two in the same class for the sake of it. If I had some CSS or some assets that needed to be included as well, they'd be imported as part of my dependencies over here as well. Webpack, when it goes through this, sees, okay, these are all the dependencies you need, let me build them into a thing, and we can ship this off as one package. Then I've got a package JSON, a solution package JSON, which then says, well, now that we've taken this, this is what we export when someone installs it. So when we install it into our main application, our main application over here, we get a very similar behavior to if we were developing on its own. Let's take a look at the details page. So when I navigate through to a details or to a movie, this is what my markup looks like here. So I've got a movie details component that comes from my product catalog service. I've got a rating component, which comes from my reviews service. And it's just rendering a component. There's some extra stuff around here to do with if the value's available or not, which I'll explain just now. I've then got a price display component, which comes from our pricing service, and a trailer view component that comes from somewhere else. So my movie details shell takes these 4 different elements, and it structures it in a way that makes sense. And this responsibility sits with, I suppose you could call it a branding team. There has to be one central team or place where everything gets brought together and any kind of styling gets applied. So this is the realm of where a kind of branding team would take place. So that's a fairly quick demo. I'll show you in a bit more detail how you make changes and independently version the changes and deploy them when we get to the next part. So we had a look at components that were React components. We bundled them up using Webpack, and the Webpack config, this is all on GitHub, so you can go check it after the session. We distributed those packages using NPM, and then we installed them again via NPM as dependencies in our main application. Each of them can be independently versioned, which means that the pricing component, when VAT rolls over on the 1st to 15%, the pricing component can deploy its own new version. The rest of the components don't know anything about that change. And the nice thing is you can iterate that deployment, or you can speed up that deployment in some components and slow it down in others. So the pricing could be on version 60, whereas the product catalog, which is only going to show the title, description, and poster, might change once every year, and that could be on version 5. You've got independent version in between the components because there's no relationship between them. When we bring everything together in the shell, that's combined by branding. It's a bit of a hacky term, but it works. So we've done front-end composition. Let's look at server-side composition. So why do we want server-side composition? Let's say we've got our 3 components on the page. The pricing component loads, and it calls its API. The marketing component loads, and it calls its API. The search component loads, and it calls its API. Kind of seems okay until we add the reviews component, and then it calls its API. And then we add the stock component, and it calls its API. And then we add more and more and more components. And before you know it, you've got hundreds of requests that are just loading little individual small bits of JSON. And while this isn't necessarily a problem, this is necessarily a problem because you've got requests taking over a second to respond for small bits of data. So we need a way to kind of take all these hundreds of little requests that we're going to have, combine it into one request and one response. HTTP 2 makes this a bit better, but it still doesn't quite solve the problem. And it's a problem that can be solved. The 2 ways that I'm going to talk to you about to solve that is API gateways and view model composition. Anyone worked with API gateways before? We've got a few of you, excellent. So spoiler alert, I tend to think view model composition is a little bit better in most situations. Obviously, it depends on the environment that you're in, though. So API gateways, what do I mean by an API gateway? A request comes into our web page. So we're now on the pricing page, for instance, or the search page, or whatever it is. A request comes in from the browser, and somehow it gets routed to our API gateway. It could be via load balancer or whatever. Our API gateway has got the request. Because we're on the pricing page, or the search page, sorry, the API gateway knows I need to make a request to the pricing component, the marketing component, and the actual search or product catalog component, sorry. So internally, the API gateway fires off 3 different requests. As, for instance, the marketing component returns, the API gateway takes that response and keeps it in memory for a bit. Then as the pricing component returns, the API gateway adds the pricing response to the in-memory object. And then when the product catalog service returns, it now says, okay, I've got all the information I need. Let me send this back to the client. So you've got one request coming in, multiple internal requests, and then one request going out. And this works really, really well. It takes us a long way towards where we want to be. The problem is, what happens when things change, or what happens when things go wrong? Where does the logic sit of how to recover, for instance, if the pricing module isn't available, or if it takes 5 seconds to return? That logic, that the business rules that determine what the behavior must be, has to sit within the API gateway. So if we look at our teams again, we've now got a database skill that we have to have. We've now got a back-end skill we have to have. We've got a front-end skill we have to have. And now we've also got an API gateway skill. It's not necessarily a problem depending on your tech stack. If you're using something like Nginx, fairly easy to configure as an API gateway. If you're using something like Data Power, you're going to have a hard time trying to find skilled people to be able to do that configuration for you. Have you guys ever had to work with a team that calls themselves the middleware team or the middleware developers? They're a very rare resource, and it's difficult to find the skills that you need. And if you have to have team autonomy, you can't really afford to have a dependency on a scarce resource, especially if it's not part of your actual team. The same thing happens if you add a new component. So if the reviews component has to now be included in the search page, you now have to deploy the back end, the front end, and API gateway rules. So it's a good step forward, but it does have its own problems that we have to address. So let's take a look at how view model composition makes us a little bit better. So view model composition says, well, you're on the search page, so the client makes a request. Well, you're on the search page, which means you need the pricing component, you need the marketing component, you need the product catalog. So the view model composer sends off the requests internally to those back-end systems. And as the results come back, the view model component or composer takes those results and holds them in memory. And once they're completed, it sends the final result back to the client. Does this sound like deja vu at all? It should, because this is exactly what the API gateway does. There's a subtle difference, though, and the difference is where that responsibility lies and where the autonomy and the business rules lie. So, for instance, instead of thinking about it as being on the search page, think about it as being on a URL or as a resource. Now, if you've done any MVC development, ASP MVC development, of course, because they've got their own special flavor of it, you would know that you can take a URL, a route, and bind that to a method in a controller. So when a request comes in on a specific URL, execute this method on this controller and return that result. Let's take that a step further. So let's say when I've got a request that comes in, I don't know what controller must execute and return a result. Rather, I want the search or the pricing component to tell me, when you get a request for the pricing API, just call me as well, and I'll put some data before you send the response back. We can do the same for the marketing component as well as for the product catalog. So each of them tells the web server itself, when you get a request that matches these parameters, invoke me so I can give you some data. The important part here is that the pricing component on the search page can say, I am important, but not really that important on the search page. So you can call me and I'll try to give you some data, but if I take more than 250 milliseconds, just carry on without me, it's fine. Just send the result back to the customer. But on the confirm order page, the pricing component is critical there. So they would say, give me 5 seconds to give the result. And if I don't give the result within 5 seconds, throw an exception all the way up to the user so they know something's wrong. So the logic of that sits within the component. And you also note there's no kind of cross-correlation between business rules. So you can't say, well, if the pricing component is available and the marketing component is available, but the product catalog isn't, then do something. Because then you've got you've got relationships between your bounded context, which means you've got the wrong bounded context. The same thing happens if you deploy a new component. If you deploy a new component, all that has to happen is that component deploys its own little package within the web server. So the way this might work, so in C#, this might work with an interface, for instance. So you deploy an interface that says, I provide data. And it's got two methods. The first is match. So what does this mean? When your application starts up, when your app pool for your web server starts up, it'll go through all of the types that it has in its app domain. Find all of them that implement this I provide data, and when a request comes through for the search page or the search URL, it then asks all of those, let's say there's 100 components. Hey, do you match this URL? Do you match this URL? Do you match this URL? And at the end of those 100, you've got, say, 5 that say, yes, I do. Then on all those 5, call the populate data method and have those 5 give you their own data. And you can then take those results and send it back as one response. So the autonomy here sits within the component itself. Let's have a look at a demo. So I've got my interface over here, which has got the two methods, matches and populate data. When a request comes in, it's a little big there. When a request comes in, I find all of the types in my system that implement I provide data and ask them, hey, do you match this specific route? So I've just got some routing information here, like what's the controller that we're on, what's the query string, whatever. Of all of those that match, I then ask all of them to populate their own data on this view model object, which is just an expander object that I create, and then I send that back down to the client. Expander object here is a hack because C# doesn't have truly dynamic types. If it was JavaScript, it'd be amazing because you can just add whatever you want. If it was TypeScript, you're going to hate yourself. But you're using TypeScript, so you hate yourself anyway. What does it look like if you are writing something that implements that? So let's take the pricing component. So my price provider implements I provide data over here. And I should have actually called this is my details page price provider, because it's different per page. The way you calculate the price might be different. So of the two methods, sorry about the zooming in and out there, I've got a matches over here, and this says I match if the current controller we're on is the data and we're on the movie details page. Or I could do some query string work here, or I could find out if it's this user that's logged in, then this applies. If it's this user, then it gets a discount. If it's whatever, the logic here, you can decide. When I send that result to the client, all I do is I'd calculate the price, taking the real price, multiply it by that, and then set that on the total price property of my view model. When I use this, so when I want to display the price, which is that guy, all I do is I look at the total price property on my view model. It seems like a magic string, but it completely makes sense because I'm the team who wrote the back end who decides where that view model is. I'm the same team that wrote the front end that knows what that view model is. If I move things around, I have to version things differently though. So if I move, instead of from the total price property in the view model, I set it to the temporary price or whatever. That is a break and change, which means my back end I have to increase by a major version, which means my front end, the version dependency doesn't match. So I then have to bump the front-end version by major. There's versioning stuff you can do there to work around that problem. So if I want to change, so instead of saying, sorry, that's what I want. So this is what my pricing team looks at when they're developing their system. So they just get a price and 35 Rand, and in the back, it automatically finds a price for Black Panther. If I want to change this to 15%, change that, rerun my application, and then by the time it restarts, it's going to then update to use 15% instead of 14%. One thing it's also going to do on the build, and I just want to show that, is I've set this project up to, every time I compile, automatically bump the version of a NuGet package that also gets automatically published as part of the compilation step here. So I've just published version 100.24 of my pricing backend component. So when I load that now on the front end, instead of 35 Rand, I get 31 or 35 Rand and 31 cents, which is quite cool. But how do I bring this into my front end? So at the moment on my front end, I've still got my 35 Rand being displayed as the price over here. My front end, stop that. My front end has got a NuGet package, which is the installed version of that pricing component. And that at the moment is set to version 22, where the current version is version 24. So if I update that NuGet package to version 24, my backend calculator is going to update to version 24 again. So when I run this, it's eventually, once it eventually kicks up on my screen, it's going to show the 35, 31 instead of the 35 Rand there. If we want to take it a step further though, so instead of just saying, hey, we've updated the backend price, maybe the pricing team wants to send some UI updates down as well, so that we can tell the customers, look, it's not our fault, it's that. So we want to put a little bit of markup here that's going to send down and say the price increase is due to that. The pricing team has got complete autonomy to do that. So they go to their front end and they say, well, let's put a div here, we'll give it a class name of note, and we'll say note price increase due to that. Okay, now as soon as I save this, and I don't want to save it just yet, as soon as I save this, it's going to go and update because I've got watch set up on my backend file. But before I do that, I just want to show you that the price in my main application has now changed. So I've deployed my new backend component. If I want to change my front end, and I'll just save that, it should update. So now the price increase there is due to that. This looks horrible though, so my pricing team also just wants to style it a little bit better. So they can also include in their packages their own CSS. So in my CSS over here, and you'll see all I've done to do that is in my package, I've included CSS as a dependency for my price display module. So for CSS, I want to say if it's in the price and it's a note, set the color to red and the font size to, I don't know, 0.8 EM, whatever. And there I've got my little display that happens in my pricing component. To ship this to production, what I would have to do is I would have to commit this to my repo, or commit it to my local repo, then push it to GitHub. But I've added the pricing component as a folder NPM repository instead of a GitHub one, which means it's automatically pushing those changes down on my front-end component for me as well. There'd be a few more steps on the way, or you could even make it less depending on what build automation you want. So that's how your pricing team or your different teams can have complete autonomy over what they send to the back end and what they send to the front end. So to summarize, it's really important that, and I use the word vertical slices here, but after the keynote this morning, bounded context is probably the better word. It's really important to get your bounded context designed right or defined correctly. If you find that you have to share information between your bounded context, you haven't defined your bounded context correctly. Another clue that you might have made a mistake is if you've got noun-based bounded context. So product catalog is a really bad example. Price is a really bad example. Those are noun-based bounded context, which probably means it needs more information than just that particular element. I can't stress enough how important it is to get these bounded contexts done right. It's also really difficult, by the way. Once you've got your bounded context defined, that team that is responsible for developing that bounded context has got full autonomy over both the back end and the front end and how that gets deployed and versioned and the requirements between them. From the UI side, you can build those up as little NPM packages and install them. Using something like Webpack, you can make a bundle or parcel or whatever tool you want. It doesn't actually really matter. Using jQuery, you can do it. On the server side, the example we had was using NuGet packages. Just do a Maven thing if you're on the Java side, or whatever. If you're using Node, again, just NPM packages. There's a lot of ways that you can do this kind of independent deployment story. When everything comes together, the term that I just kind of didn't really mention, but it was in my demo there, was IT ops. And on back-end side, the IT ops is what defines the standards that the packages must conform to. So that's where you would define the matches method and the populate data method. So in our example, we had true, false, I match. But you might want to have a level of matching. I match 50%, or I am required on this page, I'm optional on this page, but it would be nice if you had my data. And on the front end side, branding is kind of what brings everything together. The overall structure of where the different components sit and the bigger picture of the styling is handled by branding. But the individual elements themselves, the components, can define their own specific styling as well, as long as it doesn't interfere with branding. If you want some additional resources, I'm going to leave this up while I ask for questions. 39 minutes, sorry. I did say 36, 35, but I guess I took 4 minutes more. So if you have any questions you can ask, you can just get the microphone as well so everyone can hear.
So on every front end, there are a few things that you tend to share. For example, your session tokens that you need. How do you handle that kind of thing? Or does that also fall under branding?
No, so if you've got shared components, so what we saw in this was I was pulling modules in from different front-end packages. But those front-end packages had their own dependencies, predominantly on React as the kind of overarching framework that was bringing everything together. In my Webpack modules, I didn't bundle React in with. React was excluded because my main shell had React. So what you would do is the same as in the server-side code where I implemented the iProvide data interface in each back-end component, each front-end module would take an import from some other package that provides, for instance, the session token or something like that. It does become a bit of a slippery slope there as to how much you share between the things, but anything that's for instance, if we're talking about authentication. So what is the user ID? 100% shareable. That belongs within the kind of IT ops space. Authorization, gray area. Is the user logged in? Are they allowed to see this page? Yes, in IT ops. Are they allowed to authorize orders over 5,000 Rand? No, that's a business rule. So there are some things that sit within the IT ops space, but you do need to be a bit careful about how much you just kind of throw in there for the sake of throwing it in.
So my question is kind of in a similar vein. It's maybe not necessarily just about sort of the cross-cutting concerns across all your components, but sort of inter-component communication, and I'm talking on the UI side. Would you still utilize the same patterns that framework that you're using prescribes? So for example, in React, using the master of that sort of data maintained in state or in Redux or something, and then passing it via props to those components. But then you're obviously going to be reliant on the team that's tying all those components together to go and modify those codes, or would you then provide that sort of generic framework where there's some, on the UI side, a provider interface or abstraction for passing between sort of those components?
That is an excellent question. And it's not something that I think I can answer without talking about a direct scenario. And the reason is, if you're sharing data between different elements, the first question is, why is that data being shared? Do you have your bounded context defined correctly? Do you have enough autonomy within that particular team?
Maybe an example in the movies would be you setting the title of a specific movie, or maybe you're booking in a cinema, booking the movies, you set the movie and you set the time, then you've got another component that's got to then respond to that and change their layout and what's actually displayed.
Why is time a separate component to the thing that shows the rest of the layout?
So in that regard, you put that all in one bounded context, in other words, one component for that whole thing.
If I can make a suggestion, the link in the middle there, goparticular.net DevConf. So that is, Udi Dohan has got, he does a 5-day course on this stuff, specifically on identifying the bounded context and how to take the slices and put them together. There's about 9 videos of that course included for free in that. I highly recommend going and watching that. It's getting your bounded context wrong is having dependencies of notifications between different elements of your application is a symptom that you've got your bounded context probably wrong. If, for instance, and a general rule that I like to follow is, if something happens in my service and I publish an event to say, hey, order placed, if I'm publishing anything more than just identifiers, GUIDs, for instance, I have probably got the wrong bounded context there. I'd love to give you a better answer than that, but it's probably due to the way that things are being split up. And I'd love to talk to you about it afterwards if you'd like as well. Who's microphone there? Who's next? If you guys do want to leave, you can. You're welcome to as well. I'll be here for however long it takes, but you don't have to hang around if there's nothing interesting for you.
Hi. So I just want to know, how are the different teams that's working on the different components, say 3 of them changed on their front-end stuff, but it's major changes, sizing, whatever. How would they go about collaborating the changes to the website as a whole? Because if they all deploy that version and want to test it at the same time, this one can affect the layout changes on the other, and this one can affect the other one again. How do you handle that? And then a further question, the styles for the components in themselves, do they affect others? As in, if I have it's very, very bad practice, if I have an important clause there, will it affect other styles in there as well?
So I'll answer your second part first because that's easier. Yes, that's bad practice, and yes, it will affect them. Unless you're using Polymer, in which case you've got isolated styling scopes that you can use. But the way that I was doing it here, no, it'll affect everything. The first part of your question, how do you ensure that different components, if they're making major changes, don't affect the layout of other components? On the front end side, we're a bit lax when it comes to versioning things correctly. So on the back end side, if I changed the assembly binding of a DLL that I'm shipping, it's easy to tell that I've made a breaking change there. Semantic versioning tells me you can't just release this as a minor or a patch. On the front end, it's a bit more difficult. We could talk about versioning front end components as in versioning just the JavaScript with them, Or we could say, if you update to version 2 of this component, it's a major layout change that's going to affect a whole lot of other things as well. So this is a break-in change, and you shouldn't just automatically deploy this as part of your regular process. And that's probably the better approach. If you follow semantic versioning through, if we follow the conclusion of we've got a package that includes both CSS, markup, a component, and some JavaScript, and we follow that through to its conclusion with semantic versioning, any major changes that affect any of those, or any of the pieces that consume that API, will have to be a major change. And for that, you then have to go back to the branding team that's going to say, well, okay, let's bring this in and see how we can restructure our shell to make everything fit.
I guess you have to have decent styling rules and saying, for this component, you can only have a specific...
For the most part, you're not dealing with 60 different teams. Most of us aren't. So you can get away with being pretty lax about it. But when you do get into that scenario, you do need to have better versioning contracts between yourself and the shell or the branding team. I think there were a few questions this side as well.
Yeah, I think my question was the same as the other guy on the other side. If you've got two components on the UI in different areas from the same bounded context, how does that communication happen to the view composer? So you don't end up repeating yourself twice for the same data.
So if you're talking about the HTTP request,
Does that go through like Flux, or will that be a framework, front-end framework?
so are you talking about communicating directly on the front end between the two components?
Yeah, because they'll be autonomous, they're in separate NPM packages. But once they request the data they're looking for, they could be asking the same question for the same contextual video or movie or that kind of thing.
I mean, they could. It probably doesn't really matter unless your queries are really expensive. In which case, what you could do is you could also then on the view model check, is this property already set by someone else? If it is, don't query it. If it isn't. But on the front end side, if you want the components to communicate with each other, remember you, as the team that has written that front end, own those components. So you can then use Redux to communicate between them, or if you're using Angular, you can do the subscriptions or whatever you want there. On the back end side, let me actually show you. So if I had two components that were dealing with the price over here, let me stop that. So I've got my price provider class over here. If I had a second one, blah, 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 not progress, whatever, that also sent data down to the same, or responded to the same route or the same route. That's completely fine. I can copy paste this and put it into the other component as well, or the other provider. And it's not necessarily an anti-pattern that you have to prematurely optimize out unless you've got expensive queries to get the data. And if you've got expensive queries to get the data that's getting returned, maybe you should reevaluate how you're storing that data. I mean, I'm just kind of hand waving there. Maybe but you know, there's nothing stopping you from saying, if I know that I'm going to return data for two different properties, so I want to set the view model dot total price to that. I also want to set the view model dot subtotal price to the same thing. You can gladly do that. That's also an option. Or have a separate component or provider that goes through the different things. Any other questions? Just one at the back there. And then I think I'm going to step out after this, but you're welcome to come grab me. We can chat about it for hours and hours, days even. Please don't.
So it's similar but different, but we have a component we want to share across many different applications. So they have their own front ends, but we have the example is like a menu or a title bar. They all have a similar menu kind of thing. I don't know if you've done something like that as well using the same technique.
So it'll be a smaller portion of the shell. So on the front end side, you've similar to how on the back end we had the iProvide interface. On the front end side, you would have a similar thing that says, well, which of my components provide me with a menu item for my nav bar? So you'd have some type of contract that you would define on the front end that each could then implement and tell you, hey, I implement this, or I've got this menu item, I've got this menu that's got these sub-menu things. As long as that responsibility sits with the component that's been shipped, that's the important part. You don't want that responsibility to sit with a navbar team, because that's a horrible bounded context. Okay, thanks everyone. Again, you're welcome to come chat to me. And who was the guy that asked the questions over there? Just come grab a book. Well, it's on the floor now.